We know the legend wrapped in bright red velvet. We know the echoing laughter in the night, the flying sleigh, and the magical workshop hidden at the top of the world. But before the myth, there was a man. Before the magic of the North Pole, there was the reality of the Mediterranean. He was not a wizard of winter, but a humble shepherd of his people, living in a city of stone and sun. Yet, history holds secrets that are rarely whispered. There was one day, one single, impossible day in the year 343 AD, when the sun forgot to rise over the warm coast of Lycia. This is not the fairy tale of Santa Claus. This is the chronicle of the day the impossible happened. This is the story of the day winter came to the city of eternal summer, and the day a quiet bishop named Nicholas became something more. The year is 343. The location is the ancient, sun-drenched city of Myra, a jewel resting on the southern coast of what history would come to know as Lycia. To understand the miracle of this morning, one must first understand the memory of the land. For thousands of years, the stones of Myra had known only the warmth of a golden sun. The massive columns of the Roman amphitheater had baked under centuries of heat, storing the warmth deep within their marble cores, releasing it gently into the balmy evenings. The air here was perpetually thick with the scent of drying salt, heated pine resin, and the sweet, heavy fragrance of wild jasmine. The people of Myra were children of the sun. Their skin was bronze, their clothes were light linen, and their lives were dictated by the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the warm Mediterranean Sea against the harbor walls. Winter, in this part of the world, was nothing more than a rumor. A brief season of gray rains and slightly cooler winds that barely disturbed the dust on the olive leaves. But today, the laws of nature have been suspended. The dawn has arrived, but the light has not. The sky, usually a brilliant, piercing turquoise that stretches infinitely over the Taurus Mountains, has been replaced by a low, heavy ceiling of iron gray. It is a solid, unbroken expanse of cloud that presses down upon the terracotta rooftops of the city, creating a sensation of profound intimacy and isolation. The horizon has vanished. The line where the sea meets the sky has been erased by a thick, descending veil of white. It is snowing in Myra. It is not a light dusting. It is a heavy, relentless, silence-bringing snowfall. The flakes are large and wet, descending from the gray heavens with a slow, hypnotic grace. They fall in straight lines, undisturbed by any wind, accumulating layer upon layer, hour upon hour. The transformation of the landscape is total. The familiar landmarks of the city have been rendered alien and ghostly. The great olive groves that surround the city walls, usually a sea of dusty green and silver, have been sculpted into strange white statues. The ancient, gnarled trunks of the trees, twisted by centuries of growth, now stand out in stark, black contrast against the pristine whiteness of the ground. The branches, heavy with the unaccustomed weight of the snow, bow low toward the earth, as if in deep prayer or submission to this new, cold power. In the city center, the silence is absolute. Snow possesses a unique acoustic quality. It is the world's greatest dampener of sound. It absorbs the vibrations of life, the usual morning cacophony of the metropolis, the iron wheels of carts grinding against cobblestones, the shouting of merchants in the agora, the braying of donkeys, the distant hammering of shipwrights in the port, has been utterly erased. There is no sound, not a whisper. The city is held in a state of suspended animation, frozen in time like an insect trapped in amber. The Roman amphitheater, a marvel of engineering capable of holding thousands of spectators, sits empty and desolate. The rows of stone seats, carved from the local limestone, are filled with smooth, unbroken drifts of snow. The stage, where actors once performed tragedies and comedies under the stars, is now a blank white canvas, untouched by any footprint. The statues of emperors and gods that look down from the high arches wear crowns of ice, their stone eyes staring blankly into the swirling gray mist. Down at the harbor, the scene is even more surreal. The Mediterranean Sea, confused by the sudden drop in temperature, steams. A low mist rises from the dark water, swirling around the hulls of the anchored trading ships. The ropes and riggings of the vessels are coated in a layer of frost, turning the intricate web of lines into a delicate lattice of crystal glass. The wooden decks, usually warm to the touch, are treacherous sheets of ice. The sea itself is calm, heavy, and oily, moving with a sluggish rhythm, as if the cold has thickened the very water. The narrow streets of the residential quarters are labyrinths of white. The stone houses, built to repel heat with their thick walls and small windows, now look fortified against a siege. The terracotta tiles on the roofs, usually a vibrant burnt orange, are completely hidden. Icicles, long and sharp as daggers, hang from the eaves of the roofs, dripping slowly in the stillness. There is no movement in the streets. No one dares to venture out into this alien world. The heavy wooden doors of the homes are barred shut. Behind those doors, the people of Myra huddle together, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they can find, watching through the cracks in the shutters with wide, unbelieving eyes. They watch the flakes fall. They watch their familiar world disappear. They wait for the sun that does not come. And in the midst of this frozen, silent tableau, near the heart of the city, stands the bishop's residence. It is a humble structure, indistinguishable from the homes of the common people, save for the small cross carved above the wooden lintel. The roof is heavy with snow. The windows are dark. But inside, there is a presence. Inside, the man who will become a legend is waking up to a world that has changed overnight. He is waking up to the silence. He is waking up to the cold that has seeped through the stone walls, a cold that demands a response, a cold that sets the stage for a day of quiet duty and unseen charity. The world is white. The world is silent. The story begins. The silence of the frozen city was mirrored perfectly within the sanctuary of the bishop's modest dwelling. It was the hour before dawn, that deep indigo period when the world exists in a suspended state between dreams and reality. Inside his small, austere room, Saint Nicholas lay beneath a simple wool blanket. He was awake, pulled from his slumber not by any noise, but by the profound drop in temperature. The cold here was not merely an intruder. It was a heavy, pervasive presence that had settled into every corner of the chamber. It radiated from the thick limestone walls, seeping through the air like an invisible, icy mist. He lay still, his eyes open, staring up at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling, barely visible in the gloom. His breath was the only movement in the room. With each slow exhale, a small, ghostly cloud of white vapor rose from his lips, swirling lazily in the dim light before dissipating into the shadows. It was a visual testament to the unnatural chill that had gripped his home. Slowly, deliberately, Nicholas decided it was time to move. He pushed the heavy wool blanket aside. The movement was quiet, yet in the absolute stillness of the room, the rustle of the fabric felt loud. He swung his legs over the side of the narrow wooden bed. When his bare feet touched the stone floor, the sensation was instant and sharp. A jolt of intense cold traveled up his spine, a shock that woke every nerve in his body and reminded him of the frozen reality outside. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, listening. The house was utterly silent. The usual sounds of a Myra morning, the distant rhythm of the sea, the chirping of cicadas were absent. There was only the oppressive weight of the cold. On the small, rough-hewn table beside his bed stood a simple clay pitcher of water and a basin for washing. Nicholas reached out, his hand trembling slightly from the chill. He tipped the pitcher to pour water for his morning wash. Nothing came out. He paused, tilting it further. Then he heard it, the distinct, sharp sound of solid hitting solid inside the clay pot. He looked into the neck of the pitcher. In the dim light, he saw a thin, fragile skin of ice that had formed over the water's surface. In all his years in this city of eternal summer, he had never seen water freeze inside a home. He gently broke the ice with his knuckles, the sound sharp and crystalline in the quiet room. The water he splashed onto his face was shockingly cold, bracing, and pure. Now, fully awake, he turned to the wooden chest in the corner where his vestments were stored. He did not reach for the light, airy linen tunics he wore during the scorching summer months. Today, the world demanded armor against the elements. His hands found the heavy fabric he was seeking. It was his winter cloak, a garment that had seen many years of service. It was not the bright, festive red of later legends. It was a deep, dark maroon, the color of dried cherries or old wine, a rich hue that seemed to absorb the shadows of the room. He lifted it from the chest. The cloak was heavy, lined with thick, coarse sheep's wool that had grayed over time, much like his own beard. The velvet exterior was worn smooth in places, telling silent stories of long journeys and years of duty. As he swung the heavy garment around his shoulders, it settled onto him with a comforting weight. He fastened the brass clasp at his neck with practiced, cold fingers. Instantly, the biting cold of the room was pushed back. The heavy velvet created a sanctuary of warmth around him. He pulled the hood up, the thick fabric framing his face and shielding him from the drafts. Standing there in the dim gray light of dawn, wrapped in his dark maroon cloak, he looked less like a simple bishop and more like an ancient guardian, preparing to face a winter that had no name, ready for the quiet duties of the day ahead. The moment Bishop Nicholas unlatched the heavy oak door of his residence, the reality of the changed world rushed in to meet him. The air that greeted him was not the familiar, salt-laden breeze of the Mediterranean morning. It was a solid, invisible wall of ice. It was a cold so profound that it seemed to possess its own texture, a crystalline sharpness that stung the exposed skin of his face and hands, instantly tightening the flesh. He stepped over the threshold, his leather-sandaled foot sinking deep into something soft, yielding, and devastatingly cold. He looked down. The familiar worn stone of his doorstep was gone, buried under a pristine, untouched drift of snow that reached halfway up his shin. The world outside was unrecognizable. The familiar landscape of Myra, the dusty olive trees, the sun-bleached walls, the vibrant terracotta roofs had been erased. In its place was a ghostly, monochrome kingdom sculpted from ice and snow, illuminated by the flat, gray light of a sunless dawn. He pulled the hood of his heavy maroon cloak further forward, shadowing his face. The thick wool lining felt abrasive against his beard, a comforting, scratchy reality in this surreal landscape. He began to walk. Each step was a deliberate, laborious effort. He had to lift his legs high, breaking through the crust of the snow, his breath forming thick, billowing clouds of white vapor that swirled in front of his face before dissipating into the freezing air. The city was eerily silent, save for the sound of his own passage. The snow muffled everything, absorbing the echo of his footsteps, deadening the usual symphony of the waking city. He walked toward the agora, the central marketplace that was usually the beating heart of Myra. But today the heart had stopped. The market stalls, usually overflowing with colorful silks, pyramids of spices, and baskets of fruit, were now skeletal frames of wood, coated in thick layers of ice. Canvas awnings sagged dangerously under the weight of the snow. As he moved deeper into the city, he began to see them, the people of Myra. They were not the vibrant, energetic crowds he was used to. They emerged from their homes tentatively, like animals emerging from hibernation, wrapped in layers of mismatched cloth, blankets, and old rugs, anything they could find to ward off the unprecedented chill. Their movements were slow, stiff, their bodies hunched against the cold. A group of fishermen stood near the frozen fountain in the square, their nets, usually pliable and smelling of the sea, now stiff, frozen tangles of rope draped over their shoulders like iron chains. They looked at the sky, then at the ground, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and a primal, deep-seated fear. They were men of the sea, men who understood storms and waves, but this white, silent invasion from the sky was beyond their comprehension. Nicholas moved among them, a silent, dark figure against the whiteness. He did not speak. Words felt unnecessary, inadequate in the face of such a monumental shift in their world. Instead, he communicated with his presence. As he passed a young mother clutching a shivering child wrapped in a thin shawl, he slowed his pace. He paused, making eye contact. He raised a gloved hand in a simple, small gesture of acknowledgement, a silent blessing that offered no magical warmth, but perhaps a small ember of reassurance that they were not alone in this frozen new world. He saw the baker, standing outside his shop, staring at his ovens that were struggling to stay lit in the damp cold. He saw the city guards, their bronze armor dusted with frost, looking less like imposing sentinels and more like statues abandoned in the snow. He met the gaze of an old woman peering from a half-open window, her eyes wide with the childlike wonder and terror of seeing the world transformed. To each of them, the figure of the bishop in his heavy, dark maroon cloak was a familiar anchor in a sea of strangeness. He was not a magical being floating above the snow. He was a man, trudging through it just as they were, his boots sinking into the drifts, his breath clouding in the freezing air. His presence was a silent statement. This is happening. We are here. We will endure this together. He continued his slow, laborious walk toward the great church, his path marked by a trail of deep footprints in the virgin snow, a trail that was not made by a mythical sleigh, but by the steady, determined steps of a shepherd walking among his bewildered flock in the deepest winter Myra had ever known. The heavy double doors of the great church of Myra closed behind the bishop, severing the connection with the frozen, white chaos of the streets. The sudden cessation of the wind created a vacuum of silence, a profound stillness that echoed in the vast, vaulted expanse of the nave. Here, the air was still frigid, but it was a still, respectful cold, smelling of centuries-old incense, beeswax, and damp limestone. Nicholas stood for a moment in the entryway, allowing his eyes to adjust from the flat, gray glare of the snow to the deep, amber shadows of the sanctuary. He shook the snow from his dark maroon cloak. The flakes fell to the stone floor, surviving for a few moments in the chill air before slowly turning to dark spots of water. He did not remove the heavy garment. The church, usually a refuge of coolness against the summer heat, had now become a cavern of ice. The stone pillars, thick and imposing, radiated a chill that seemed to seep from the earth itself. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing rhythmically in the empty space. He was not walking toward a throne, but toward a simple, heavy wooden table set to the side of the altar, his place of work. This was where the reality of his station lay. He was a shepherd, yes, but in the Roman world, a bishop was also a judge, an administrator, and a guardian of the city's grain and order. He reached the table and sat in the high-backed wooden chair. The wood was cold and unyielding. On the surface of the desk lay stacks of parchment, scrolls made of dried sheepskin that crinkled stiffly in the low temperature. Beside them sat an inkwell, the black liquid inside thickened by the cold, and a simple reed pen. Nicholas extended a hand and lit the thick candle that stood on the table. The wick caught the flame, and a small, warm sphere of yellow light pushed back the gloom, illuminating the lines of worry and wisdom etched into his face. He pulled the first scroll toward him. It was not a religious text, but a ledger, a record of the city's grain stores. In times of crisis, the spiritual leader was also the one who ensured his people did not starve. For hours, he worked in the silence. His breath formed small clouds that drifted over the ink as he wrote. He reviewed petitions from local merchants, disputes over property lines that had been buried under the snow, and pleas for aid from widows. He read each word with deliberate care. His eyes, tired but sharp, scanned the rows of Latin and Greek script, seeking the path of justice in every line. There was no magic here. There were no elves hammering toys, no flying creatures. There was only the scratching of a reed pen against rough parchment, the sound of a page turning in the quiet room, and the heavy, burdened sigh of a man carrying the weight of a frightened city on his shoulders. He stopped occasionally to rub his temples, his fingers cold against his skin, contemplating the difficult decisions the winter would force him to make. If the snow continued, the trade ships would not dock. If the ships did not dock, the grain silos would empty. In the solitude of the church, surrounded by the statues of saints who stared down with frozen stone eyes, Nicholas was not a legend. He was a man of logic and law, fighting a silent battle against chaos with the only weapons he had: his mind, his pen, and his unwavering sense of duty. The flame of the candle flickered in a stray draft, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall. Shadows that looked like the silhouette of a man bent under a heavy load, enduring the cold so that others might find warmth. The candle on the bishop's heavy wooden desk had burned down low, creating a pool of melted wax that hardened into strange, abstract shapes on the iron holder. The hours of the morning had passed in a blur of administrative duty, a silent rhythm of reading, signing, and sealing. But now the rhythm was broken. Nicholas sat perfectly still, his hand hovering over a single, unrolled scroll that lay separate from the others. It was not a formal petition from a merchant guild, nor was it a report on the grain silos. It was a personal plea, written on a scrap of coarse, cheap papyrus that had been slipped anonymously under the church door before the snow had sealed the city shut. He read the words again, though he had already memorized their tragic weight. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotched in places as if stained by tears or trembling hands. It told the story of a neighbor, a man Nicholas knew by sight, a man of noble birth who had once walked the streets of Myra with his head held high, wearing fine linens and commanding respect. But fortune, like the wind, is fickle. The letter detailed a slow, agonizing descent into absolute poverty. The family's wealth had evaporated, their lands were gone, and their debts had mounted like the snowdrifts outside. But the true tragedy lay not in the loss of gold, but in the threat to the future. The man had 3 daughters, 3 young women who were now of age to be married. In the strict, unforgiving laws of their time, a woman without a dowry had no future, no prospect of marriage, and no protection. The letter did not shy away from the grim reality that awaited them. Without money to secure their hands in marriage, the father would be forced to make the most heart-wrenching choice a parent could face: to sell his own flesh and blood into servitude, or worse, to surrender them to a life of shame on the streets, simply to survive. Nicholas looked up from the parchment, his eyes fixing on the flickering flame of the candle. The silence of the church seemed to deepen, pressing in on him. The cold air around him felt suddenly heavier, burdened not just by the winter, but by the suffocating weight of human despair. He imagined the father, sitting in his cold, empty house just a few streets away, watching his sleeping daughters, knowing that tomorrow might bring the end of their innocence. The bishop leaned back in his stiff wooden chair, the joints of the furniture creaking in the quiet room. He closed his eyes. The image of the 3 sisters burned in his mind. He saw their future unraveling like a frayed rope. He felt the father's shame, a sharp, metallic taste in his own mouth. This was not a matter of theology. It was not a matter of church politics. It was a raw, bleeding wound in the heart of his parish. He thought of the scriptures he preached of charity and mercy. But words were wind. Words could not buy freedom. Words could not secure a future. This situation required something tangible. It required gold. His mind drifted to the heavy iron chest kept in the sacristy, the church's treasury. But he stopped himself. That money belonged to the poor of the city, to the orphans and the widows who relied on the daily bread distribution. He could not drain the community's lifeline for one family, no matter how desperate. Then, a memory surfaced from the depths of his past. He remembered his own parents, long since past. He remembered the inheritance they had left him, a personal fortune that he had largely untouched, saving it for a moment of true necessity. He realized that the necessity had arrived. He opened his eyes. The weariness was gone from his face, replaced by a look of steely resolve. He reached out and rolled up the papyrus scroll with deliberate slowness. He did not file it away with the grain reports. He tucked it into the deep fold of his maroon sleeve, close to his skin. He stood up. The movement was slow and stiff, his limbs protesting against the cold that had settled into his bones during the long hours of sitting. He blew out the candle. The sudden darkness was absolute, save for the faint, gray ghost light filtering through the high windows from the snow-covered world outside. In the dark, a plan began to form, a plan that required silence, darkness, and absolute secrecy. He would not go as a bishop with fanfare and blessings. He would go as a shadow. He turned and walked toward the back of the church, his footsteps light and purposeful. The time for administration was over. The time for action had begun. Saint Nicholas moved through the shadows of the nave, leaving the dying candlelight of his study behind. He entered the sacristy, a small, windowless chamber behind the altar where the holy vessels and vestments were kept. The air here was dry and smelled of ancient cedarwood and myrrh. It was a stillness so profound that even the dust motes seemed suspended in the cold air, waiting for his movement to disturb them. He approached a corner of the room where a heavy chest sat on the stone floor. It was not the gilded box of a church treasury. It was a simple, sturdy trunk made of dark oak, bound with bands of blackened iron. This was his personal chest, the repository of the inheritance left to him by his parents. Wealth he had touched rarely, saving it for a burden that prayer alone could not lift. He knelt on the freezing stone. The cold seeped through his heavy robes, biting at his knees, but he did not flinch. He reached into the folds of his sash and withdrew a heavy iron key. The metal was dull and pitted with age. He guided it into the keyhole. The mechanism was stiff from disuse and the penetrating cold. He turned it slowly. The sound of the tumblers clicking into place was sharp and precise in the silence, echoing off the stone walls like the snapping of a dry branch. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. The hinges resisted, groaning with a low, mournful sound of friction that spoke of years of silence. The scent of old metal and dry parchment rose from the interior. Inside, resting on a lining of faded wool, lay the gold. These were not the bright, freshly minted coins of the current empire. These were solidi from an older time, heavy Roman coins stamped with the profiles of emperors whose names were slowly fading from memory. In the dim light filtering from the nave, they did not glitter. They glowed with a deep, sullen luster, dormant power waiting to be awakened. Nicholas reached in. His hand, calloused from years of work, brushed against the cold metal. He did not grab a handful. He picked them up one by one, feeling the weight of each coin, testing its density. 1, 2, 3. He counted them silently, stacking them on the stone floor beside the chest. The sound of gold settling on stone was a distinct, dull clink, a sound of substance, of permanence. He divided the treasure into 3 equal piles. 3 piles for 3 lives. 3 piles to buy 3 futures. He stood up and moved to a shelf where scraps of fabric were stored, leftover linens used for cleaning the altar or wrapping candles. He selected 3 pieces of rough, unbleached cloth. The fabric was coarse to the touch, smelling of wax and dust. He returned to the gold. He took the first piece of cloth and laid it flat on the floor. With deliberate, slow movements, he placed the first pile of coins into the center. He gathered the corners of the fabric, pulling them together to form a pouch. The coins shifted inside, grinding softly against each other. A heavy, metallic murmur. He took a length of twine, a rough hemp string, and wound it tightly around the neck of the pouch. He knotted it once, then twice, pulling it tight with a strength that belied his age. He repeated the ritual. The second pile was wrapped, the fabric folding over the gold like a shroud. The twine was cut and tied. Then the third. The process was methodical, almost prayer-like in its repetition. Lift, wrap, tie. Lift, wrap, tie. Now 3 heavy pouches lay on the cold stone floor. They looked unassuming, simple bundles of rag and string. But Nicholas knew their true weight. He picked them up. They were heavy, dense with the promise of freedom. He held them for a moment, weighing them in his palms, feeling the cold, hard reality of the metal through the thin cloth. He opened the heavy folds of his maroon cloak. He tucked the pouches securely into his belt, distributing their weight so they would not clink against each other as he walked. He felt them press against his side, a secret burden that he would carry into the night. He closed the oak chest. He turned the key, locking away the empty space where the gold had been. He stood up, the joints of his knees cracking in the silence. He adjusted his cloak, pulling the hood lower over his eyes. He was no longer just a bishop. He was a carrier of hope, a shadow preparing to merge with the greater darkness of the storm. The heavy iron key turned in the lock of the side door with a finality that vibrated through the wood. Saint Nicholas pushed the door open, and for the second time that day, the sanctuary of the church surrendered to the siege of the winter. But this time, there was no gray daylight to greet him. There was only the night. He stepped out into a world that had been erased by darkness and buried in white. The storm had intensified since morning. The snow was no longer falling in gentle, drifting flakes. It was driving hard, slanted by a biting wind that swept in from the sea. It swirled around the stone columns of the portico, piling up in deep drifts against the walls. Nicholas paused to adjust his burden. The 3 pouches of gold, tied securely at his waist beneath his heavy robes, pressed against his hip, a solid, comforting weight. He pulled the hood of his dark maroon cloak forward until it completely obscured his face. In the darkness, the deep red velvet appeared almost black, allowing him to merge seamlessly with the shadows. He was no longer the recognizable figure of the bishop. He was a silhouette, a nameless traveler on a secret errand. He stepped from the shelter of the doorway into the street. The snow was deep here, reaching nearly to his knees. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, testing the ground with each step to avoid hidden patches of ice beneath the powder. His leather boots crunched softly, compressing the fresh snow, leaving behind a trail of deep, solitary indentations that the wind would soon fill and erase. The city of Myra lay in a state of suspended animation. The houses he passed were dark, their windows shuttered tight against the cold. No light escaped from the cracks. Wood and oil were precious commodities tonight, burned only for survival, not for comfort. The entire population had retreated inward, huddled around dying embers, leaving the streets to the wind and to this lone, hooded figure. He walked through the narrow, winding alleyways of the residential quarter. The stone walls of the houses loomed on either side, coated in frost that glittered faintly in the gloom. The usual smells of the city, cooking fires, animals, refuse, were gone, frozen into neutrality. The air smelled only of ice and ozone, sharp and clean. At the corner of a street, a stray dog, curled into a tight ball against a wall, lifted its head as Nicholas passed. It watched him with intelligent, weary eyes, its breath puffing white in the darkness, but it did not bark. It seemed to sense the purpose in the walker's stride, or perhaps it simply lacked the energy to challenge the cold. Nicholas acknowledged the creature with a slight nod inside his hood and continued on. The wind tugged at his cloak, whipping the heavy fabric around his legs, trying to find a way in, but the velvet held. It was his armor, his shield against the elements. Inside the hood, his breath was loud and rhythmic, the only sound accompanying him on this pilgrimage. He was not walking toward the wealthy district with its grand villas. He was heading deeper into the labyrinth of the poor, toward the edge of the city where the houses were smaller, the walls thinner, and the despair deeper. He navigated by memory, turning corners that were barely visible under the snowdrifts, guided by an internal map of his parish. With every step, the gold at his waist bumped gently against his side. It was a physical reminder of his mission. He was carrying the future of 3 souls through the frozen present. He was carrying light into a world of shadow. He reached the end of the street and stopped. Before him stood the house he sought. It was a humble structure, dark and silent, indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the invisible weight of tragedy that hung over it. He stood in the shadow of a cypress tree, watching, waiting, becoming one with the night. Saint Nicholas stood motionless in the profound shadow cast by an ancient cypress tree, allowing his dark form to merge completely with the obscurity of the night. The house that stood before him was a stark monument to fallen fortunes. Its rough stone walls were chipped and worn by years of neglect. The timber roof sagged visibly in the center under the crushing weight of the accumulated snow, and the thin wooden door looked brittle, as if a strong gust of wind might shatter it. He did not move immediately. He waited, a statue of patience, listening intently to the rhythm of the sleeping house. He heard nothing but the high-pitched whistling of the wind curling around the eaves and the faint, deep groans of the house's timber beams contracting in the extreme cold. The entire city was asleep. The street was utterly empty. The moment for action had arrived. He stepped out from the protective shroud of the shadow and approached the side wall of the house. The snow here had drifted high against the stonework, burying the foundation almost up to the window level. He moved with exaggerated slowness, lifting each foot and placing it with deliberate care to avoid the loud crunch of breaking through the frozen upper crust of the snow. His breath was held tight in his chest, a pressure building behind his ribs with every silent step. He reached the window. It was not glazed with glass. It was a simple, square opening cut into the thick stone wall, fitted with a heavy wooden shutter meant to keep out the elements. In the heat of summer, it would be flung open to catch the sea breeze. Tonight, in this blizzard, it should have been barred tight and sealed against the cold. But whether by a stroke of fate, or perhaps due to a broken latch forgotten in the overwhelming despair of the night, the shutter hung slightly ajar. It left a narrow, vertical black gap, barely wide enough for a man's hand to pass through. Nicholas paused, his heart beating a slow, heavy, and powerful rhythm against his ribs, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in his own ears in the silence of the snow. He reached beneath the heavy folds of his cloak, his gloved fingers fumbling slightly with the stiffness of the cold as he untied the first pouch from his leather belt. The weight of the gold was dense, solid, and reassuring in his palm. He extended his arm slowly toward the opening. The rush of freezing air escaping from the gap in the shutter was palpable against the skin of his wrist. He peered into the absolute darkness of the room. He could see nothing, but the faint, stale scent of old wood smoke and the dampness of unwashed wool reached him. He leaned closer, positioning his hand just above the stone sill. He did not throw the pouch. He released it with a gentle, controlled opening of his numb fingers. The linen bag dropped into the void. There was a tense, stretched microsecond of absolute silence as it fell through the air of the dark room. Then came the sound. It was not a loud crash. It was a dull, heavy impact, the distinct, unmistakable sound of significant metal weight hitting a hard earth floor, muffled slightly by the thick layers of cloth wrapping it. It was a sound of substance, a thud that vibrated faintly in the quiet night. Nicholas froze, his body rigid against the wall. He held his breath completely, straining his ears, listening with every fiber of his being for any reaction from within. A gasp of surprise, the creak of a rope bed, a cry of alarm. But there was nothing. The profound silence of the room swallowed the sound of the gold completely. The inhabitants, likely exhausted by worry and numbed by the cold, slept on, entirely unaware that the trajectory of their lives had just pivoted on the axis of a single, silent act of charity. He waited another long moment, ensuring the silence held. Then he untied the second pouch. His movements were smoother now, more practiced. He guided it through the gap and released it. The second impact sound was identical to the first, a twin heartbeat of hope landing in the darkness. Finally, he took the third pouch, the last of his inheritance, the last chance for the third daughter. He dropped it into the blackness. 3 heavy sounds, 3 lives altered in the dark. He did not linger to see the result of his actions. The instant the third pouch landed, Nicholas withdrew his hand from the window. He took a large, careful step back, melting once again into the safety of the shadows. The tension drained from his body, replaced by a profound, quiet sense of completion. The deed was done. The seed of a legend had been planted in the dark soil of a frozen night, left to bloom in the morning light. He turned away from the window, his heavy cloak swirling silently around his ankles, and began the long, slow walk back into the anonymity of the storm. Inside the small stone house, the silence was different from the frozen stillness outside. Here, the silence was heavy with the weight of human worry and the exhausted sleep of despair. The air was thick and cold, smelling faintly of ancient wood smoke from a hearth that had long since burned down to gray ash, and the damp, lanolin scent of worn wool drying on a line. The main room was steeped in absolute darkness, save for the faintest gray luminescence filtering through the cracks around the ill-fitting door, hinting at the snow-covered world outside. The family slept fitfully on thin straw mattresses pushed close together for warmth. The father, exhausted by grief, slept a deep, troubled sleep. His 3 daughters, whose futures hung by such a slender thread, lay nearby, their breathing shallow in the frigid air. Then, the silence was shattered. It was not a loud noise that broke the stillness, but a sudden, alien intrusion of heavy substance. The first linen pouch dropped from the high window ledge and struck the packed earth floor near the cold hearth. The impact was a dull, dense thud, a sound that spoke of significant weight meeting solid ground, muffled slightly by the layers of rough cloth. A small cloud of fine dust, unseen in the dark, puffed upwards from the floor. Almost immediately, it was followed by a second heavy impact, identical to the first, landing just inches away. And then a third. The 3 pouches settled on the floor, rolling slightly before coming to rest against the stone surround of the fireplace, right beneath where the family's thin, mended stockings hung limp and empty, waiting for a morning fire that might never come. The vibration of the heavy objects hitting the floor traveled through the packed earth. In the corner, the youngest of the 3 daughters stirred. She was pulled from a deep, dreamless sleep not by a loud bang, but by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, a disturbance felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears. She opened her eyes to the crushing darkness. Confusion clouded her sleep-heavy mind. She lay still for a moment, her heart quickening, trying to understand what had awakened her. She pushed herself up on one elbow, the dry straw of her mattress rustling softly, a sound that seemed incredibly loud to her own ears. She squinted into the gloom, her eyes desperately trying to make sense of the shapes in the room. Her gaze was drawn toward the hearth, the source of the disturbance. There, on the floor, she could just barely make out 3 unfamiliar, rounded shapes that hadn't been there when they went to sleep. They were dark lumps against the lighter color of the ash-dusted floor. But then, a movement at the periphery of her vision caught her attention. Her eyes shifted upward, toward the high window in the stone wall. The heavy wooden shutter, which should have been sealed tight against the blizzard, was slightly ajar. Through the narrow vertical gap, a strange, pale light was pushing in, the ethereal reflected light of the moon hitting the deep snow outside. And in that slice of light, she saw something. It was there for only a heartbeat. A shape filled the gap in the window. It was massive, blocking out the swirling snow. It was not the recognizable form of a man, but a swirling mass of deep, dark color. A rich, heavy maroon that looked almost black in the moonlight. It was fabric, heavy velvet that seemed to absorb the light, billowing slightly in the wind. She saw the suggestion of a large hood, a shadow within a shadow, turning away. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shape was gone. The gap in the shutter was empty again, showing only the chaotic dance of the falling snow outside. The child blinked, unsure if she had been dreaming. Her mind, still half asleep and steeped in the folklore of her people, could not process the reality of a bishop on a secret mission. What she had seen was too large, too silent, too mysterious for a normal man. In the dark alchemy of her sleepy imagination, the figure transformed. It was not Nicholas of Myra. It was an ancient, magical guardian of the winter night, a being clothed in the color of deep blood or dried fruit, who came from the storm to bring miracles to the desperate. She lay back down, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes wide open in the dark. She did not wake the others. The secret felt too heavy, too magical to speak aloud just yet. She stared at the ceiling. The image of that fleeting, maroon shadow burned into her mind. In that frozen, silent room, in the mind of a half-awake child staring at 3 mysterious gifts near the hearth, the seed of a legend was planted. A legend that would outlive the stone walls of Myra by thousands of years. Saint Nicholas stepped away from the wall of the humble house, his figure detaching itself from the deep shadows and merging once more with the swirling chaos of the storm. The moment he turned his back on the window, a profound change occurred. The tension that had coiled tightly in his chest and shoulders for hours began to unspool. The physical weight at his belt was gone, replaced by a lightness that felt almost unnatural against the pressing force of the wind. He began the slow, arduous retracing of his steps through the buried city. The walk back seemed longer, quieter. The adrenaline that had fueled his journey outward had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that seeped into his muscles with every lift of his snow-heavy boots. The blizzard showed no sign of abating. The snow was falling harder now, a relentless curtain of white that obscured the familiar shapes of the buildings. He walked with his head bowed against the gale, his eyes fixed on the churning ground just inches in front of his feet. The cold had worked its way through the layers of wool and velvet. His fingers inside his gloves were numb, thick and clumsy, and the tip of his nose burned with the frost. He passed through the labyrinthine streets of the poor quarter, retraced his path along the wider avenues of the merchants, and finally saw the dark, hulking outline of the great church and his adjacent residence looming through the gray murk. It stood like a silent stone fortress against the elements. Reaching his own heavy oak door, he fumbled with the iron latch. His frozen fingers struggled to grip the icy metal, slipping several times before finally gaining purchase. He pushed with his shoulder, and the door groaned open, protesting the intrusion of the snow that had piled against its base. He stepped inside and immediately pushed the door shut, sealing out the roar of the wind. The sudden silence of the entry hall was staggering. It was a thick, heavy stillness that rang in the ears. The air inside, though still freezing, felt still and dead compared to the violent energy outside. Nicholas stood for a long moment in the pitch blackness of the hall, leaning his back against the door, breathing deeply. The air smelled of cold stone and old incense. He began the slow, deliberate process of shedding his armor. He reached up with stiff, aching hands to the brass clasp at his throat. The metal was so cold it felt hot against his skin. It took several clumsy attempts before he could undo the fastening. The heavy maroon velvet cloak, now sodden with melted snow around the hem and shoulders, slid from his body. It dropped to the stone floor with a heavy, wet slumping sound, pooling around his ankles like a dark shadow. Freed from the weight, he felt a sudden, intense rush of fatigue. He moved blindly through the familiar darkness of his home, navigating by touch until he reached his small sleeping chamber. The room was exactly as he had left it, frigid, silent, and waiting. He did not light a candle. There was no need for light now. His work was done. He moved to his narrow bed. The wool blanket was stiff with cold, and the straw mattress rustled dryly as he sat down. He swung his legs up, his muscles protesting the final movement, and pulled the heavy covers up to his chin. The cold of the bed sheets was shocking at first, stealing the last remaining warmth from his skin. But as he lay there, perfectly still, his body began the slow work of generating heat. A small, precious pocket of warmth began to form around him, a cocoon against the frozen world. He stared up into the absolute blackness of the ceiling. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the city, burying his tracks, burying the secret of the night. The sound of the wind buffeting the stone walls was no longer a threat. It had become a rhythmic, monotonous lullaby. His mind drifted. He thought of the 3 leather pouches sitting on a dirt floor in the dark. He thought of the futures that had been rewritten without a single word being spoken. A profound sense of peace settled over him, heavier and warmer than any blanket. The burden of duty had been discharged. The shepherd had tended his flock in the darkest hour. His eyes grew heavy. The boundary between the dark room and the landscape of dreams began to blur. His breathing slowed, deepening into the rhythm of sleep. The cold was forgotten. The night was over. And in the heart of the frozen city, the man who planted the seed of a legend finally, and peacefully, slept.